Hey, family, it's your sister Jocelyn here, and welcome to another episode of Faith on the Journey. If this is your first time tuning in, we welcome you. We are so glad that you are here and want you to know that we're committed to helping you strengthen your faith, heal your heart, and discover a sense of community. And we do so through a variety of ways by connecting with a team of Christian counselors and offering trauma healing trainings across the country. You can learn about these resources and so much more by visiting our website at faithonthejourney.org. Again, that is faithonthejourney.org. Now, today we're welcoming to the show a man who's on mission, and I mean that literally, and he is spreading it with the world. Brian Fleming is a combat wounded war veteran who was injured by a suicide bomber in Afghanistan. He's an author, international speaker, resilience trainer, and founder of Use Your Story, where he shows other trauma survivors how to get unstuck and discover more healing by sharing their testimonies with the world. I'm so excited to welcome him to the show today. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks for being here. I really was interested and intrigued by your powerful testimony, particularly based on what you have gone through, what you survived, and now what you're doing now. And I talked a little bit about it in your bio, but I actually want to hear from you, your testimony. Would you share that with us?
Yeah, the short version, and it will get a little more in depth, but I went into the army after 9/11 and was sent to Afghanistan in 2006. Uh, my vehicle got blown up a couple times by a roadside bomb, and the second one was a suicide bomber who in Kandahar he drove his minivan into the door of my vehicle, into my door, and exploded about 3 feet away from me. And I ended up getting burned second and third degree. Second degree on my neck and hand, or my face and neck, and then third degree on both my hands. Thankfully, the face and neck have healed. The hands required reconstructive surgery and 14 months at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. Burn rehab, reconstructive surgery, rehab for head traumas. I had to really learn how to put my life back together. I had some post traumatic stress, some mild traumatic brain injuries from the multiple concussion blasts and how close I was to those, and a lot of issues about things like not being able to remember things or very hyper vigilant after coming back home, uh, things like that. Just typical things that are symptoms of post traumatic stress. And I'm happy to say there have been a number of things over the years now that I've been able to discover about myself, become self aware, and also just be able to climb past some of those things to a very great extent and really get a lot of my life back.
That's great, Brian. And I know it was not easy. And I'm curious as it relates to your faith, because I know you're a believer. What role did that play in your recovery?
Faith as it plays a role in trauma recovery, for me, it always meant it was sort of like even when you didn't understand what was going on, you had hope that it would perhaps someday make sense. And we have this idea that if we get closure, if we understand that if we finally understand and make sense of something, we'll have closure with it, which I don't know is always true, but we think we will. I remember that song by Jeremy Camp called "Walk by Faith" that he had around that time that I was injured. I don't recall exactly the year, but his wife died, and he completely just broke. And I remember the song. He says in the chorus of the song, he sings, "I will walk by faith even when I cannot see, because this broken road prepares your will for me." So he wasn't really out of it. He wrote that song in the middle of that war inside. He didn't get out of it and then write it. He wrote it in the pain, in the fog of that war. And it became a beautiful song. It became a movie. It became a book. I mean, it's one of his biggest hits ever. And I remember just being in my own situation, hearing that and thinking, well, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, I saw the movie by about Jeremy Camp, was really inspired by his story and his music. And when you think about the fact that suffering and pain is a part of our walk, and sometimes we won't understand why, but still believing that God is with us in those moments, it could be very challenging, but that's a part of our faith. And for you, what helped you outside of maybe Jeremy Camp's music? Was it community? Was it the people you were around? Was it your prayer? What kind of application did you use to help you grow your faith?
The biggest thing that helped me through that tragedy in my life was the fact I met one of my best friends in the world about 5 months after the injury. He was a Vietnam vet named Dave Reaver who he's got injured in Vietnam horribly, burned way worse and injured worse than I was. And he survived. He came home. He's a preacher, and he started using his story back in, 1970, 71. He used to sneak out of the hospital and go preach in San Antonio. And so he came to the medical center and was talking to me and 30 or 40 other guys who have been blown up, shot up, Iraq, Afghanistan. And he was joking about how he had been burned in Vietnam and just laughing about his own tragic story. And we were laughing about it. It got us laughing. Well, he and I, we hit it off and we became friends. And for gosh, 15, 16 years now, we've been great friends. And that first year after meeting him, after I got out of the military, I went to work with his company. And what he did, I mean, this is a godsend. He put me on almost every one of his stages for about a year. And he said, "Here, take 2 minutes, Brian. Tell him about yourself." Uh, and he said, you know, and by the way, you couldn't pay somebody at his level to do this for you. Like, there's no amount of money that could equate to like, what he did for me. He felt led to do this for me and to mentor me, not just in speaking but in life, and it was very helpful. That was one of the biggest thing that made the difference. And I remember him saying, he said, Brian, every time you get up on stage, you get a little bit better." And I used to think he only meant, as a professional speaker. Every time you do it, you get better, like anything. But he didn't just mean you'll every time you get on stage, you get better as a speaker. Every time I got on stage and I told a bit of my story in an effort to help other people, I got a little bit better. I'm pointing to my head and my heart right now if you can't see me. If you're listening to audio, every time it was like a release valve on a big air tank. Just little by little by little over time, it kept that thing stabilized because if you don't release every now and then, the thing eventually combusts, it explodes. And so I had to start finding little things that were release valves for me, practical, real things. And that looks different for everybody. But for me, it was the speaking because I was realizing other people who had never gone through what I went through were also dealing with a lot of the same mental health issues I was dealing with because we all get hurt in different ways. We all know what pain is like. That's a universal language we all understand. But people were relating to what I was dealing with in the aftermath, and that let them know they're not alone, and me too. And we would share ideas, and maybe something worked for you or didn't work for me, but maybe it did. And just being able to see that there is potential meaning in my suffering because I saw it helping other people when I didn't even have actual advice for them.
That was powerful. I think sometimes we underestimate how moving our testimony could be in someone's life. And you use your story to help others on the stage, and you see how other people might not have the stage to share their story, but they can use their story in other means, whether it's writing a book, whether it is sitting down with someone and sharing their testimony. And I appreciate how you talked about it being a release and finding ways to release whatever that might be. And so God was taking you on this journey of sharing your testimony. You were healing physically along the way. And talk a little bit about that process because I know you were kind of giving the cliff notes, but your actual physical healing was a journey as well. How long did that take you? And was there some bumps along the way that you had to work through in terms of recovering physically?
Yes, definitely. Physically, due to the extent of the burns that I suffered, when I got to the hospital, 3 days from it took 3 days to fly me medevac me from Kandahar to San Antonio. And when I got to San Antonio that first night, the nurses all took me in a shower room and they had to do a process called debridement. And I had never heard of that word before. But basically, they had to get all the burned, dirty, charred skin off my body, or it would have killed me by infection. And so I remember the head nurse walked up to me. I was laying on a table. I didn't know what they were going to do. And he said, "Sergeant Fleming, we're going to do this as quickly as possible. So it'll be as painless as possible." And I didn't know what he meant. And right after that, him and two or three other nurses, they all pulled out razor blades and pinchers. They had to start shaving and cutting the burn charred skin off of my hands, my face, and my neck, and they keep you awake for it. They shoot you up with some morphine. Really, it just makes you feel like you're floating. It doesn't help with the pain, and so I basically was getting filleted alive, and I've never wanted. I've never been suicidal, but in that moment, that was the only moment in my life I've ever prayed to die. It's sort of like, God, if you're good, you'll just let me die. Just let me go unconscious, whether I'm asleep or I die. I don't care. My wife will be fine. That was like the breaking point. And I do thank God for unanswered prayers because sometimes when you're going through the worst thing, you can only see what's immediately in front of you, the pain, whatever you're going through. You can't always see outside your own fog of war that's around you when you're in something, going through something terrible. But just outside that fog, there's all kinds of different perspectives and purpose and meaning and things that can happen, but you're just so in your own head that you can't see more than 2 inches in front of your eyes, so to speak. And so a lot of people say, well, gosh, Brian, how were you able to be so resilient? How did you survive all that? The truth is I didn't have a choice. I didn't I didn't die. So it's like, well, how am I so resilient? Like, well, I didn't die. So you just kind of have to. What do? You survived. Well, you somehow just make it through, and that was quite an experience.
Yeah, I appreciate, Brian, how you relate what you've gone through using war, for example, but you also relate it to someone who has not gone through combat, maybe the war of their mind, the war of the emotions that we all face along the way. That situation there, though, Brian, that was really tough. And I'm sure your recovery, even beyond that particular moment, was difficult. And I'm going in this direction because I know a lot of listeners out there have physical ailments, injuries, and they're trying to recover. They don't know if they might get back to the way they used to be before the injury or the illness. And dealing with physical injury can be traumatic in and of itself. It could be a lot mentally that you're struggling with when you realize that things aren't the way they used to be, or they're not sure how things are going to turn out in the future. So, if someone is dealing with that right now, what words of advice or what can you share from your story to encourage them?
Well, a lot of times, what you're going through, it will go back to normal the way it used to be, but a lot of times it won't. Sometimes you need to accept the fact that you are now living in a new normal. Things are not going to be how they used to be. And so, with as tough as that is, you need to adapt. You need to set things in place in your mind and in your life and adapt however you need to make your journey moving forward the most productive and what's best for you and in a way that's not harmful to you or anybody around you. And it's a hard pill to swallow. I have friends who, they woke up and, they had no legs. They got their legs blown off and, they woke up out of the coma a week later and the last thing they remember is they were in Afghanistan. Now they're in a hospital and they have no legs. That's I can't relate to that, but I have many friends who have had that exact experience. And it's one of those things you have to stare it in the eye and you just have to look at it and you just have to start making adaptations even as human beings anthropologically. The It's not always the strongest creature that survives the longest. It's the one that can adapt the quickest to its environment. And you and I are in an environment, whether maybe it's financial or maybe it's in your relationship or maybe it's a trauma you went through. We're all in an environment, and if you're struggling there, adapting as fast as possible is one of your best bets. Just finding a way to do that and being open to people's advice. Here's the thing too. I've heard a lot of people say, and I used to say this too. If you haven't been in my shoes, like, don't try to tell me, give me your advice. You won't understand. But the truth is that, in the military, I was a team leader in an infantry platoon, a 17-man platoon in the mountains of Afghanistan. And we had what's called close air support, warplanes and war helicopters that would fly over us and they'd tell us where some of our enemy are that we didn't know were there without them. And sometimes they would assist us and save us from some horrible situations we would have walked right into. So I always tell people, don't be afraid to ask for help. We're taught, not to or to suck it up, and that's true. But if you're in an infantry platoon in a war, fighting on the ground in a war zone, and you have close air support available, and you don't call it in because you don't want your commander to think you can't handle yourself on the battlefield. We don't want people to think our platoon can't handle it. Then you all get wiped out, or you get really hurt, or a bunch of people around you get hurt. That would be absolutely stupid. And that leader would be either killed by the enemy, maybe his own people, his or her own people, or be relieved of their command once they got back if they did. Because that people who have different perspectives, they're not blinded by your perspective. They're above your battlefield, sort of flying over it, looking in from different directions, and they can advise you on step here, don't step there. You're walking through a minefield. Step here, don't step there. You can't see it, but I see it. Step left, not right. It's that kind of thing, and it has a being open to that is a huge piece of it.
Wise counsel. Woo! I can't tell you how important that is and not allowing your pride to get in the way. Or I think sometimes even people pleasing, there's a number of different things that can get in the way or wanting to be seen a certain way, seen strong. And we have to get beyond all of that and have what did you call it? The people hovering over us. I forget what
Oh,
it's
close air
called.
support.
Air support, I call it wise counsel, whatever you call it,
Yeah.
you do need to have that in your life. And for you, it sounds like you had a good circle of friends around you. You had this gentleman who was mentoring you as it relates to your speaking business. And eventually, as you were working through your physical recovery, you even said you had some cognitive things going on. Is that true? Did I hear that at
Oh,
some
yeah.
point?
Headaches, short-term memory loss, uh, just cognitive dissonance with some things. Uh, I mean, you name it. You look at the laundry list of symptoms of a traumatic brain injury. I pretty much had them all.
Okay. Okay. And was it a lot of PT, occupational therapy, the different techniques to help you to get back on track?
Yeah, it was finding out how to adapt, like what what adaptive things what were helpful for me specifically the most. I mean, I would forget things, and so my command would say, "Well, write them down on a notebook." So I write down things on a notebook, but then I lose the notebook. And so then what the army did, they use what's called military intelligence, which is a really funny oxymoron if you've been in the military. And they gave me a $500 like little PDA data assistant, that they used to have like in the mid 2000s. And I when I moved a year ago, I found it in a box and it had never been touched. I lost that too. So it's like for me, like I text message myself things, or I have a notepad on my phone, or I set alarms ahead of time that I will have to run into these reminders, or my calendar on my iPhone, things like that, just so I have to remember because they will run into me because I set them ahead into the future to do that.
You adapted. And I appreciate and celebrate your mentality, not focusing on woe is me, but okay, what do I need to do to survive, to move forward, to optimize what I have right now? That's a mind shift.
Yeah, there's a time to feel it and be in the pit, but then there's a time you have to get up and start walking.
Mhm. And so for you, it was a decision, I'm not gonna stay in this pit for too long. I have to walk. I have to move.
The thing with me is there was never too much of a pit. As odd as that might sound, the pit was like a prolonged. It was more like a long gradual hill. I don't know if you've ever been like a runner, but some of the worst distance running are those long, gradual slopes you run up, and it wasn't like a big pit I fell in, it was more like a long climb out of it, and that your thighs are burning, you're out of breath, and it's just enough to torture you, but you just focus on your next step. People who are going through something traumatic, they don't need a 10-step plan, a 10-year plan. They need their next step, like a foot in front of them. Like, what's the next thing they can do? And then you take that step. I remember in the military doing 20, 30 plus mile ruck marches through the night and carrying a heavy pack. You would be so tired and so in pain. And you think, then one guy yells out, "Hey guys, only 18 more miles to go." And everyone just wants to punch that guy because you're mentally, you just, oh, but what you do is you don't focus on, we have 18 more miles to go. You know what? There's a phone pole. There's a big tree up there in like 100 yards. Just get to that phone pole, then I'll decide what I'm going to do next. Then you get there. All right, the next phone pole. Or as some of my Navy SEAL friends say, just make it to the next meal. It's the same concept. Like focus on what you can get to and make that step. And then when you get there, do it again. And I say that's how you climb your way out of hell if you're in it. It's one step at a time.
One step at a time. I say sometimes 1 minute, 1 second at a time. We're just climbing, climbing. That analogy just stood out to me. I held on to it, and it feels like you're climbing, but you will get to that next step. And for you, your next step ended up growing into this whole thing. Talk about what you're doing right now. You're speaking, you're helping other trauma survivors. Talk about Brian today.
Yeah, this turned into an unintended speaking career. I didn't know anybody did this. I didn't know people went around doing itinerant speaking. And I've written a few books on human resilience at this point. I've spoken to a lot of people. Like, gosh, I don't even know how many to tell you. Just if you look me up online, if you just Google Brian Fleming, blown up guy, Brian Fleming speaker, you'll you'll see all the pages of it, all going all the way back to about 2009. But I sort of I kind of joke with people if they don't think I'm a very good speaker. Don't worry, I never meant to do this anyway, so I don't really care. But I don't really get that comment much. But it turned into an unintended career. But the thing about speaking is it gave me a redemptive perspective on my suffering. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust, in his amazing book "Man's Search for Meaning," he talked about how when it comes to suffering, he said suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. Suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. And it's not that you're not still suffering, but it takes on like a 1 degree shift where it's also something else now. It shifted slightly in a direction. And it was redemptive for me just seeing that my really tough struggles were somehow giving other people hope that they can win their battle that they're facing right now too. And for some, there was some sort of purpose or meaning that came out of me that I didn't know was in there because of that. And so now I've spoken, all over the world, mainly all over North America, but I've been international a number of times. And I'm not just sharing my story. I'm not projecting my story on people. My story is about 5% of my talk. I look at what I learned through my story and who it can help in what particular battles they're facing. And over the course of the past 16 years, I've had so many people say, "Wow, Brian, I didn't go to Afghanistan. I wasn't injured by a suicide bomber, but I was sexually assaulted or I was abused or I lost, their husband or brother died in war or they got a cancer diagnosis or some trauma in their life." And they said, "I wish how do I do what you do? Like I want to do what you do, but with my story. I want to use my story as well," which is why I have my program, Use Your Story at useyourstory.com, because I'm at a point where I'm kind of tired of living and sleeping in airports and hotels. And yeah, and it's like so many people have asked me, and everyone has a story. You can reach people I can't with your story. There are people who will relate to you because of who you are in every way, and there are other people who will relate to me who won't relate to you. But if we're all out there sharing our stories have the power to heal the world because we relate to stories. We relate to each other. People who don't look the same, don't come from the same place, different political beliefs, cultural, whatever. When you start talking about pain, you start seeing people get glued together because everyone goes, "Whoa, I understand that they're like me." That empathy is there, that connection. And so that's what hooked me on speaking. It wasn't about ever just telling my story. It was about helping other people with my story and what I learned through it.
That's purpose-driven work, Brian.
Absolutely.
You're helping people to reclaim their story, even reclaim their tragedy. And as it relates to some of the major takeaways, if you were to say out of one of your books, particularly you talk about a lot on resilience and overcoming different challenges, what are some of the key takeaways you will offer someone as it relates to resilience?
Don't sit around. Stay active. Be moving. Even getting out of the military, one of the big things a lot of veterans face is that in the military you always have a mission. The missions are handed down by your command. You always know what the mission is. You get out of the military, there's nobody making the missions. There's nobody making the missions anymore. You have to create the mission. So my advice there would be to find your next mission as fast as possible. What do you care about? Like, and forget what everyone else says. When you're laying in bed at night and you want to do something with your life, or you feel led or called to do something, what is that thing? That's probably a really good indication that it might have something to do with that. But when you have your next mission, you have something to live for that transcends you. Because you hear about people committing suicide because of what they've been through, they can't handle it. People who are on a mission don't commit suicide. People who are trying to save and help other people don't generally, I'm not saying they don't generally commit suicide, for example, because they still have something to live for. And they're thinking about, with as bad as this is, what would this do to so and so and this group of people who I'm leading if I lost hope and they look to me for hope? What hope is that left for them? And so we'll often stick around and go through a large amount of pain, more so for other people than we will for ourselves. And so find your next mission. Just start taking baby steps on it. And, for the past 16, 15, 16 years, speaking, getting booked to speak, sharing my story, that was my mission. And I've done that and I'll continue to do that. But now it's shifted. It's time to give back and to help other people, to replicate myself, because with all the issues going on in the world, I think one of the best things we can do is equip people to share their stories, but position their stories in such a way that it helps solve a problem in the world and it helps people. Because if I just go out telling my story, that's great. Wow, we survived that. But then everyone's sitting around going, "Well, what am I supposed to do with it? I was inspired, but what now?" See, that would be my fault. That would be bad on me. That would be ill prepared of me. I tell people what they can do with it. I show them possibilities and I show them exactly how to do it. And so that's my next mission. You always have to have your next mission.
Have your next mission. And Brian, for my last question, I would love for you to just kind of think back to Brian, who was just rebuilding his life after the major event. What words of advice would you give your younger self if you could talk to yourself back then?
The battle the battle you're in doesn't last forever. Most things in life don't last forever. Things naturally change. Um, just by nature of existence, things are constantly changing and morphing and transforming. And where you are now, you're not going to be here forever. And the more you try to do something with it, the quicker you'll probably get out of it. And you might try 50 things and 48 don't work, but you had to crawl through those 48 that didn't work to get to that 49 or 50 where you found the thing that you're finally looking for, that clicked, whatever that realization was, that helped you.
Don't give up. Don't give up. That's good, Brian. That's good. Thank you so much. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, if you go to useyourstory.com, I have a free resource there called the Share Your Story Roadmap. And basically, what it is, I show trauma survivors and people with unique life stories how to not only share their story, but make their first $500 speaking. And the reason I say that, I don't like that $500 thing to sound like a marketing gimmick. But the thing is, my first mentor, he said, "Brian, this is not about money." He said, "But money is the grease on the machine that allows us to go do what we feel called to do. And without the money, you can't help very many people." And so a lot of people have asked me, "What's the first step? How do I share my story? How do I launch? Or do I need a book first?" Or they just have no clue where to begin because nobody teaches this, not in school. And so, if you want to make a difference sharing your story, I'll show you exactly how. It's called the Share Your Story Roadmap. It's totally free, and I'll show you how to, a very easy step by step process for sharing your story as a public speaker, and also how to make your first $500 speaking. So, if you just go to useyourstory.com, that's where you can learn more about that.
Good stuff, Brian. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Keep up the great work you're doing.
Thanks, Brian. And thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Faith on the Journey. I hope you were blessed by it. And if you were, you know what to do. Please leave a 5-star review and share this episode with a friend. Also, if you are looking for a Christian counselor, visit us online at faithonthejourney.org. Again, that is faithonthejourney.org. So that's it for this week, family. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, you stay encouraged and you keep your faith on the journey. I'll see you soon, family.